And I'm delighted to introduce Liesbeth De Mol, Liesbeth is known to some of you through her work in organising the HAPOP and HAPOC conferences, and also anybody who was involved in the absolutely incredible 24-hour History of Science Around the World thing. What was that? It was about 18 months ago. That was Liesbeth's mastermind.
No, it was not just, it was the whole team behind it. So.
Anyway, so Liesbeth, thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. So, of course, I'm very happy and grateful to be here, and I thank all of the organizers and also the Newton Institute for hosting and inviting me. So I think it's also great and very special to have a history program here at the Newton Institute. I'm also very happy to be here for a very different reason, since this is my first official talk since a very long sick leave, so it's kind of a bit special for me too. And so also because of the process that I'm still going through, I can now say at least that at some point I might appear to be overdoing it a little bit, but this is just me coping, and I kindly ask you to kind of be, you know, a bit empathic. So I first wanted to make some publicity for something very else, so something very different. So Barbara Hoof and Climerio Paula da Silvanetto have took the initiative to organize a series of early career scholars workshops. So you can still subscribe to that. All information can be found on the DHST website. I think the first session is end of February, so I recommend this strongly to any early career scholars present here today. So let me now turn to the talk. So as we have heard repeatedly throughout the last days, we received this inviting question from Adrian: what do you consider to be the most significant and open question or lacuna in your area of the history of mathematics? So I decided to go for quite a personal and honest answer. So I took the question very seriously, and for me, the immediate response was I should do a methodological talk on the history of computing, sharing with you my thoughts on that field. So I'm quite aware that the public is not mostly historians of computing, but historians of mathematics. But I will relate to that field too, especially in the first part. Sorry. In the first part of my talk. So here is the argument outline that you could also find in the abstract. So what I will try to do is develop a problem and a paradox from the history of computing. Essentially, the argument goes as follows. In its strive for independence from the field it studies, computing, the history of computing has developed a number of methodological values which are coming mostly from the history of technology, but in so doing it risks to undermine those very same values. And my personal answer is a new paradox in a certain sense to resolve this original paradox, and it's essentially a presentist and nomadic approach to critically take distance from current developments. So here is the outline of my talk. So I will first provide you some background on the history of computing in relation to the history of mathematics, and in fact the history of mathematics. Then I will try and phrase it to problems, sketch my approach, and kind of conclude. So let me turn to the first part of my talk, which is heavily anchored in a paper I did with Maarten Bullink, Making the History of Computing, which was published in Revue de Synthèse, and where we look into the history of computing in relation to the history of mathematics. So as most of you probably know, the first computers were constructed in modern computers were constructed in the 1940s to essentially do applied mathematics. At that time, the people who were involved in that practice had quite diverse backgrounds. But quite soon there, even though this was really in a tradition of applied mathematics to some extent, people started to realize that there was something particular about the problems that emerged in that practice. I call that the surprise of programming. Regretfully, I cannot go into that too deeply. And this realization of an independent problem from mathematics was deepened by the steady commercialization and diversification of users and clients of the machines. So soon we see that there is a search for a disciplinary identity. So I recommend Matti Tedere's book, The Science of Computing, which is, I think, one of the only books out there that kind of considers this disciplinary shaping of the field. So, so one early response to this search for a disciplinary identity was to search for a foundation, a science of computing and of programming. This is not surprising since many of the pioneers were mathematicians. So well known from this context is Edsger Dijkstra, who on frequent occasions and quite provocatively made it clear that the programming field in particular was too much of a craft, a bricolage, and he argued very regularly for the need for a mathematical foundation for the field. Steadily, there emerged this vision of computing as a mathematical science, but of course this only lasted for some time. Nowadays, this is definitely no longer the case. The computer scientists, in the sense of the people who work on foundations and mathematics, the theoretical computer scientists, if you want, have become a minority group in a sense. So, and I quote Peter Denning here, computer scientists need to come to grips with the fact that they are no longer in control of the field. They do not call the shots. Their research is not the driving force behind most IT innovations. They are one of many professional groups in the field. But this just as an aside. So let me now turn back to the history of the field. So in that history, we see that it is not just mathematics that is being instrumentalized for the disciplinary identity. Also, history itself is used to give the field a historical foundation. This happens in particular in the 60s and especially the 70s, where we see a number of initiatives in that direction. So there is, for instance, the Computer Oral History Collection, which contains a whole range of interviews with computing pioneers. There was the IBM exhibition, A Computer Perspective, organized by the IMSS. And there were also the first books, so the one on the picture you can see is the one by Hermann Goldstein, The Computer from Pascal to von Neumann. So in this search, in this instrumentalization of history for the field's disciplinary identity, there is one group of computing people who actually look into the direction of mathematics and logic. They look at the history of mathematics and logic to inscribe the field of computing in that tradition. So there are two developments I see there. So the first one, there are those who want to recast computing as a science of algorithms. So most well known in that context is Donald Knuth. For those who do not know him, he's really a very well-known computer scientist, but also Goldstein belongs to that tradition, I believe, to some extent. So Knuth in particular used Babylonian mathematics to construct an intellectual prehistory for programmers. And to do this, he relied on Neugebauer's edition and interpretations of Babylonian mathematics, mathematical texts. So tying together a long-term history of doing mathematics from the Babylonians to the digital computer served Knuth's goal to legitimize his science of algorithms. So that way of doing history of Knuth is very technically oriented. One might call it anachronistic. So for instance, in the paper Ancient Babylonian Algorithms that was published in Communications of the ACM, a high-end magazine for computing academics, in one of the subsections is called Babylonian Programming, and I quote from that section, they, the Babylonians, worked with a machine language representation of formulas instead of symbolic language. So this is one part of inscribing the history of computing in a broader history of mathematics. Another part of that is to inscribe it in a longer history of mathematical logic. So there emerged a dominant narrative in certain milieus that computing not only needs logical foundations, but that it can in fact be historically grounded in mathematical logic. So significant here is the quote by the chairs of the International Research Conference on the History of Computing at Los Alamos, organized in 1976, resulting in the well-known proceedings, A History of Computing of the 20th Century. So I quote from the introduction, few realized in the 30s that the formalism of mathematical logic was the magic key to programming languages as well as to computer design. All inventions motivated by the purest of mathematics mark the beginning of the computer revolution. Theory is the captain and application the soldier. So another and more well-known inscription in this context is how Alan Turing was being instrumentalized as the person who supposedly invented the modern computer. So this narrative, I think, started in the 1950s when people working in machine design started to realize that they didn't need too much to actually achieve general purpose computation. And of course, the paper, yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot go into the details of the Turing paper, so I apologize for those who don't know the paper. But essentially, he, among others in the paper, he constructs a so-called universal Turing machine, so a machine that can compute anything that is considered to be computable. And so in the 50s, this was appropriated as a theoretical argument to show it suffices to have but a few commands to build general purpose machines. So this is where that narrative emerged. To be very clear, the idea that Turing invented the computer has been completely deconstructed by the historians. So, so also worth mentioning here is that also Kenneth O'May, a well-known historian of mathematics, contributed to this inscription of the history of computing in the history of mathematics. So he too was invited to the Los Alamos conference, and his, the resulting paper was not written by him because he died very shortly after, but by some of his colleagues. The paper is called Historiography, a Perspective to Computer Scientists. And in that paper, he identifies two traditions in the history of mathematics. One is a tradition of a mathematical science, and the other one is the tradition of mathematical technology, which he also calls the algorithmic tradition. So the emergent computing field then is recast as a continuation of that algorithmic tradition, and was declared by Kenneth O'May as the queen of technology. And this is, of course, quite in opposite to the idea that mathematics is the queen of the sciences. So the paper has two essential messages. The first one is towards future historians of computing and the idea to inscribe the history of computing into the history of mathematics. This did not happen, and I will come to that quite soonish. And then for the historians of mathematics, there was a message to give more attention to this other tradition, the tradition of mathematical technology, the algorithmic tradition. And I think that has kind of happened in the history of mathematics, right? With the attention to calculational practices, algorithmic traditions, also technology and its significance for the history of mathematics, etc. So now I need to do a quick detour related to the shaping of the field of the history of mathematics itself, and you will soon see why it is relevant to the history of computing. So as most of you in this room probably know, around the same time when the field of computing was looking for a disciplinary identity, also historians of mathematics were striving for disciplinary independence, amongst others. Were striving for disciplinary independence. And so in doing so, they were essentially going against what Karen in her talk called, they were going against the idea of a mathematical history. So most well known in this context are the Unguru debates, which were quite, can I say, vitriolic in a sense, led especially by André Weil. So central to this debate was the idea that Greek or Babylonian mathematics is not algebraic. This was, amongst others, the claim by Unguru, and should thus not be put into those modern terms. So this obviously contributed to a growing gap between historians and practitioners, but it also led to the emancipation of the history and the historians of mathematics as an independent field of research. So why is this all relevant to the shaping of the history of computing? Well, Michael Mahoney, who is known to historians of computing as, as a very well-known historian of computing, he got caught up in the debate. He wrote so sorry if this is not new to you, this story, but in 1971 he wrote a biography on Fermat, and he made a very clear anti-Whiggish statement. It's a bit small on the slide, but he says that essentially that Whig history represents the greatest danger of all. And so André Weil wrote, I read the review, he wrote a horrible, like really a destructive, he destroyed the complete book because of that. So he kind of got caught up in these Onguru debates, but this apparently had a huge impact on Mahoney, and so he kind of never recovered from that passage. And so since that time, he did some more papers in the history of mathematics, but not too much, and steadily and slowly, he moved more into the direction of the history of computing. So for instance, in 1987, he became the editor of the ACM history series. So to this day, he is still considered to be one of the most important historiographers of the history of computing. So he wrote a bunch of papers, I don't know the exact number, 10 to 20, in which he phrased a number of principles that historians of computing should follow methodologically. So on the next slide, I mention, this is really a summary, and this is far from complete, but some important methodological principles that he framed are the following. So first of all, and this is very important, I think, he explicitly inscribed the history of computing in the history of technology. This was done in a 1988 paper, the history of computing in the history, the history of computing in the history of technology. So secondly, he kept true to his anti-anachronism in a paper titled What Makes History, which at some point in time was recommended to prospective authors to the IEEE Annals for the History of Computing. He said, it involves the imaginative, so doing history involves the imaginative exercise of suspending one's knowledge of how things turned out so as to create the possibility still open at the time. Thirdly, there is this idea of decentering the machine, which was, amongst others, developed in What Makes the History of Software Hard. And this is the idea of stepping away from machine-centered, people-centered, hero-centered histories, and to look much more at the practices, the people involved, the decisions they made, etc. So I quote again, the history of computing, especially of software, should strive to preserve human agency by structuring its narrative around people facing choices and making decisions. So obviously, Mahoney was not the only historian involved in essentially founding the field of the history of computing. There were also people, and I'm not mentioning Martin Campbell Kelly, for instance, it's not on the slide, but amongst others, Bill Asprey, Paul Ceruzzi, and Mike Mahoney established the Special Interest Group for Computing, Information and Society, which I think is still the most important community for the history of computing. But it was founded as a special interest group within SHOT, so the Society for the History of Technology. So this kind of confirms the paper of Mahoney, where he inscribes the history of computing inside of the history of technology. So steadily an agenda emerged. So a methodological agenda, I would say. So first of all, the methodological focus would be more on externalist or decentered histories, so focusing on economical, sociocultural, political, and institutional developments. It celebrates distance from machine-centered, person-centered, technique-centered, etc. histories, and internalism, history of ideas, etc., are considered to be of the low-hanging fruit variety. So yeah, I won't go into this storytelling aspect of it. So of course, after the 80s, the field of the history of computing further professionalized. We have well, since the late 70s, we have had our own magazine, IEEE Annals for the History of Computing, and I'm happy to have Troy here, who is currently its editor-in-chief, and some editorial members. We have specialized book series. We have a variety of workshops and conferences. Of course, there's the CNRS conference, but there are also others. There was the foundation of HAPOC, if I may say. There have been monographs, but this is all a bit less important for the point I'm trying to make here, which relates to our own Angeru moment in the small. So I apologize for the people who know all about this, but yeah. So in 2014, Donald Knuth, whom I mentioned earlier, gave a provocative talk at Stanford University with the title, "Let's Not Dumb Down the History of Computing." So I think the message of that talk is immediately clear. Essentially, he very much regretted the disappearance of more technically focused histories. And the reason why he did this talk was that he had read a paper by Martin Campbell Kelly that was published in the Annals, titled The History of Software, in which Martin Campbell Kelly celebrates the evolution within the history of computing away from more technical histories. He called them the low-hanging fruit variety, and towards more external histories. And he also concludes that this is the right direction for the field, at least as far as the history of software is concerned. So in the talk, Knuth, and that's the picture up there, he shows a letter that he wrote to Martin Campbell Kelly, and he explains that he started to cry when he read the paper, and supposedly you can still see traces of the smears that the tears caused on the letter. So it was quite a dramatic moment. And when this was diffused on the CNRS mailing list, discussion started. So, but very quickly, that discussion was, at least that's how I experienced it, was recast in terms of the disciplinarization of the history of science. Gillespie, in particular, referred to earlier and comparable moments in the history of science and the history of mathematics. So this discussion is not new. In the end, I think that discussion was more or less concluded by a paper written by Tom Haig, who is here in the room, The Tears of Donald Knuth, in which he kind of, that's how I interpreted it, which he concludes for a kind of division of labor between the historians and the computer scientists. If the computer scientists want a particular kind of history, they should create the positions in their departments, but historians who are in the US in particular usually hired at history departments, they cannot do this kind of history writing because it's kind of diminishes their chances at a job. So the argument was anchored in the social reality of the job market. But then my reflection on that paper was, should we allow ourselves to be fully determined by the job market? And also in my personal experience, it was kind of very different from, or my personal trajectory was very different from what I read in that paper. So I was, yeah, it was a reason for me to reflect a bit deeper about my own methodological stances. So to end this part of the talk and zooming out a little bit, so as is kind of clear, even though I didn't dive deeply into that, practitioners are definitely no longer the main audience for historians of computing. I think there is a significant communication gap between professional historians and computing professionals. This is partially because of personal experience, talking to people, but also, you know, the way the history is being done by the historians of computing. And at the same time, computing has pervaded our lives. So based on this, I ask, what, if anything, does this mean? Or does this have to mean anything for the history of computing? Obviously, I think yes, otherwise I could stop here. So in the abstract, I promised to speak about two problems and a paradox, but I realized when developing the argument that it's actually a problem and a paradox. So a problem and a paradox from the history of computing, and I will try to phrase this first by going to two deeply related observations from the history of computing. These observations are not at all new, but basic to consider. So the first observation is the idea that the computer is everywhere. So this is a point that was historically developed in the recent book by Haig and Ceruzzi, which I highly recommend, and you have the title there on the slides, and in which they write a history of the computer in terms of the computer slowly but steadily becoming universal, say from the archaic once-in-a-lifetime machines like ENIAC to so-called smart devices and cybercritical systems. Obviously, the notion of being universal can have a number of different meanings, conceptions, instantiations, interpretations, and we find them also in the history of computing. So I quickly show you three of them. The first one is a very famous one that I hinted at before. Again, I emphasize, I'm using the Turing quote here not to suggest that Turing somehow founded the modern computer, but it kind of states the idea. It's the idea that one particular machine can be used for a variety of purposes. So it's the classical computer, if you want. So this is a quote by Turing. It can be shown that a single special theoretical machine, in his case was initially theoretical, can be made to do the work of all. It could in fact be made to work as a model of any other machine. The special machine may be called the Turing machine. A second conception of this notion of the computer being everywhere or being universal arises in the late 70s and the early 80s. And here the notion is very much focused on the use. So it's very much related to the emancipation of the user to a certain extent. So the computer can be fit to any kind of use. It's the idea of personalizing the computer to what you need. So, and this is clearly phrased in this quote by Papert. The computer is the Proteus of machines. Its essence is its universality, its power to simulate, because it can take on 1,000 forms, it can serve 1,000 functions, it can appeal to 1,000 tastes. Finally, and this is a very recent, well, it's in a sense not that recent, but it kind of showed up again in the discourse. There is the idea of the computer outperforming human intelligent tasks. It's the very idea of general AI. So the quote is here by Sam Altman, who we all know as, being involved with OpenAI, where he says that 95% of what marketeers use agencies, strategists, and creative professionals for today will easily, nearly instantly, and at almost no cost at all be handled by AI. Sorry. So from there, I go to the question, shouldn't we dare ask as historians, what in these kind of pronouncements is ideology and what is actually a fact? So as an example, I use this fairly recent opinion piece that was published in the communications of the ACM in the wake of the launch of ChatGPT, in which Welsh essentially claims the end of programming as we know it. Programmers who do kind of classical programming in programming languages would be replaced by AIs and they would become prompt engineers. This is clearly informed by the idea that slowly but steadily the computer, or better computation, is becoming universal. It's overtaking everything. But in how far should we take all such statements for granted? We can of course ask here, as historians, even though it's very recent, so you should be careful with that, who is Welsh? Welsh is a founder of an AI business. But that will not help us to differentiate between fact and ideology here. For that we need more, and I believe historians too can do something here. And what the more is essentially to go to kind of debunk these kind of claims also from a more technical history. But that's for the last part of my talk. Second observation, which is closely related to the previous one, is the idea of the invisible machine. Again, not very new, I know, but also here we can find different instantiations of the statement throughout the history of computing. The first one is the idea of the computer being ubiquitous. Ubiquitous computing was a field that arose in the late 80s, early 90s. We have, for instance, Mark Weiser, who in his paper, The Computer for the 21st Century, celebrates the idea that the computer would disappear from sight. And I quote, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. We are therefore trying to conceive a new way of thinking about computers, one that takes into account the human world and allows the computer themselves to vanish into the background." Second instance, and this is a very difficult one, but a very, at least for me, something I want to work on in the near future, relates to the idea of the computer, and it's actually, the computer becoming invisible from the user perspective. This was a view that was promoted in the 80s and is now still very dominant, I would say, as a design philosophy. It contributed to a growing divide between users as developers and users with a big capital U. People who don't know anything about the technology and the techniques that underlie the devices they are using. The computer for these people has disappeared. It has to appear as something familiar, and so it should not be technical. Which is, I'm not making any judgment here. I think this was a necessary development, but we should also dare to question it. So, and this is a quote I really like from the Human Interface Guidelines that were written in the Apple company. So not very long ago, most users of personal computers were also programmers. Today, most personal computers are seen as tools that magnify a person's ability to perform all kinds of tasks. This obviously relates to the previous point, observation. The Apple desktop interface provides a consistent and familiar computer environment. People aren't trying to use computers, they are trying to get their jobs done. Given this focus on people and their tasks, the Apple desktop interface has had to assume a model of people in order to suit the interface to them. Thirdly and last instantiation, and this is something that has annoyed me a lot throughout the years, is this comparison of the computer to a car. A computer is like a car. So it is a metaphor, but it has been taken quite seriously, I have noticed, and I think it emerged, I might be wrong because I didn't properly investigate this, but definitely in the 80s it is something that starts to appear in the discourse. So it is a confirmation of a view that sees computing and the computer purely as a technology to be used, and just like a car, the user of a computer just has to be able to drive it. He should not be able to look inside of the car or of the computer. But that comparison is also a tricky one. A universal medium that is hidden is, in my view, not comparable to a car in the old sense of what a car was, of course. So, and this brings me to concluding for the second observation, which is similar to the other one. So here again, we should dare ask as historians, what here is ideology and what is fact? And so here I want to mention an editorial that was published in Nature in 2016 that at least upset me a lot. So in that issue, there were quite a lot of papers on Google's AlphaGo, which had just beaten the world champion in the Go game. And in the editorial, the machine is described in religious terms. The machine becomes an oracle. Its pronouncements have to be believed. So I found this extremely problematic. I was really upset by that statement, especially in a journal like Nature. Of course, there is a certain technical truth to the fact that one cannot access these so-called AI models in the same way as one can access a source code, a traditional source code. I am very aware of that, but it is quite dangerous to accept this closedness uncritically and so raise no questions, for instance, about the data being used when training the models. So in that regard, the vision of an invisible machine becomes, well, no, I'm reading my notes, but they make no sense, so I skip this. So here, as historians, again, we need to dare ask in how far such statements are affected by a repetition of something in the discourse, and how far they are actually scientifically valid. So I'm now ready to turn to my problem and the paradox. So the problem is a problem of scope, and it relates very much to both observations, I think. So this is based on the practical universality of the computer, and it raises the question of what is or should be the topic of the history of computing. So there are a number of possible replies to this. So the most dominant one today, it appears to me, in the history of computing, is that, ironically, the field of the history of computing should be less about the core topics of computing and more about the variety of uses of computing devices, a direct consequence of the computer being everywhere, I suspect. From that perspective, we, the historians of computing, have no reason to complain or worry, since really the topic is all over the place. This is, for instance, confirmed by the list of topics we have seen at a recent CICSIS conferences, but also can be observed from the increased popularity of the topic in other history of science conferences. But from a very different perspective, and quite clearly expressed by Tom Haig in his book with Ceruzzi, but also later in a paper he wrote that was published in 2024, there is this idea of the computer being everywhere and nowhere at the same time results in a significant risk that the topic of computing as a core topic too is disappearing from sight. Hence, there is the question of the history of computing steadily dissolving itself. So, and this is the problem we are facing, either we are fine with this effective decentering from the core topics of the history of computing, or like Haig, and I tend to agree with him, we see that ironically the history of computing as a field is threatened by its own success. To me at least, there appears to be no clear solution to this problem unless we recenter again, and I return to this later. I'm watching the time. So let me now try and sketch the methodological paradox I wanted to phrase. So this, I really struggled with this point, so it's very delicate and difficult to make. But it's also heavily related to the previous point. So I sketched how the history of computing went through a process similar to what happened to other histories of science and the history of mathematics in particular, and how in that process the field developed its own methodological values. These values and these principles are perfectly fine and comparable to those developed in other histories of science from an internalist perspective, internalist in the sense internal to the field of the history of computing. However, from the outside, and given my above observations, there are a number of problems. There appears to be a confirmation of an ideology in those methodological values that supports the victory of technology over science. So it is a fair decision and an understandable decision to describe the history of computing in the history of technology, but how then can we evaluate statements like those made by Kalanick, the former Uber CEO, like we are going commercial, this can't just be about science. For that, to evaluate that, we need to kind of step a little bit outside of the history of technology, I believe. Second, it appears to celebrate the dissolution of the technique itself, the technique of computing itself, into black boxes. What we are supposed to be looking at as historians are the outside appearances of the techniques, not their internals. Finally, so as historians, but also as users. Finally, and this heavily relates to the previous points, it celebrates the user-developer division. I refer here to the earlier declared division of labor between historians and computing people, but also in particular to the idea that historians should not care about what lies beyond the graphical user interface, if I may say it like that. So, assuming then that you accept this analysis, I know it's tricky, we must ask how can we take critical distance from these facts as ideologies if we take its basic assumptions for granted in our own methodological values. I'm not implying here that there was some kind of a unconscious or conscious choice in the history of computing to embrace these ideologies as methodological values. It's more like they converge, they seem to converge. So I don't know if this point comes across clear enough. So, as I said, assuming then that you accept this analysis, we must ask how can we take critical distance from these facts as ideologies if we take its basic assumptions for granted. This then is the paradox I want to phrase, a history of computing that unintentionally ends up in a situation which it wanted to avoid. What are the alternatives? I am pretty sure there are a variety of alternatives. I'm an optimist, but I want to give you my personal answer. And the personal answer is based on a paper I wrote and which was originally titled Confessions of a Nomad. It became a subtitle. I must say that this has been one of the most difficult papers I ever had to write. So I was asked by the editor, Bill Asprey, to write a paper as a philosopher and give my view as a philosopher on the field of the history of computing. So I started to sketch a structure and an idea, but very soon I realized I was extremely uncomfortable with the idea of speaking as a philosopher, even though I have a background in philosophy. So I really started to struggle with my own disciplinary identity and realized, and did a very deep reflection on my career to realize that I was not a philosopher at all, but I was also not a historian. So what am I exactly? So the conclusion for me, and I still embrace it, to be honest, was that I am a nomad. So the paper was written in a semi-autobiographical style. I will go a little bit into that, but I cannot present the full paper here. But I wanted to refer to a paper by Orell, which considers the autobiography by historians as a style. And one of the styles is called experimental biography. And they write about this as follows: the role that the historians assume as authors of their own lives challenge the norms of objectivity that rule their profession and provide them, if they are engaged with the epistemological issues, a privileged platform for renewing and revitalizing their conception of history. Okay, so so this is an important slide to me. So I wanted to say that whatever I'm going to say now and whatever was written in the Nomad paper, I would never have been able to write this down without the Programming Collective. So here you see a collection of pictures from the people who were involved at the end of the project. So the financing stopped by now, but I still think the collective is kind of alive and it's open-ended, so anyone is kind of welcome. So I thank all of the programming members, also the past members who are not on the picture here, for shaping me as a researcher. So here's a bit about my personal background. So I want to leave time for questions, so I fear I really have to move a little bit more quickly. So I already mentioned that I have a background in philosophy. I did my PhD in philosophy, but my original love was in art history, where I did a master thesis. My supervisor at the time, when I was doing art history, gave me the advice that I was zigzagging too much as a student. So I was interested in too many different topics. And he told me, if ever you want to make a career out of this, you will have to specialize. But I decided, well, I could not listen to him because this was not what I wanted. So I wanted to explore a diversity of topics. So I continued along that path. I also had an immense dislike, and I think now I can say it was fear of computers. And I can say, I guess I was flirting with neoluddism. So I have a weird relation to computers. And also, and this is quite important in my thinking today, I was exposed quite heavily to methodological dogmatism in the philosophy department. So the department was dominated by analytical philosophers, which is perfectly fine. The problem was that they were very depreciatory, if not ridiculing, what was called continental philosophy. And no argument was given for that depreciation. So it was really strange for me, especially because I started to read continental philosophy. In particular, I started to focus on the work of Martin Heidegger. I did my master thesis on Heidegger and the implications of his philosophy for architectural design. So it's quite a different topic. But my reading of Heidegger has been extremely important for me in my changed relations to computers, and in particular the essay Vragen nach der Technik, the question concerning technique, in which he speaks about or questions the essence of technique. And so the essence of technique, it's very difficult for me to speak of Heidegger, but the essence of technique is the way in which people interact with their world, their surroundings, and the way in which they bring things into being into the world. And he differentiates between old and modern technique. And of course, he's not very happy with the essence of what he calls modern technique. In his view, the essence of modern technique is about how people order things into what is called, in the English translation, a standing reserve, das Gestell in German. So I cannot go into that deeply, but a lot of people have read that essay as a techno-pessimist essay, but for me, I read it in the exact opposite direction. For me, it led me to the realization that my reluctance to use the computer was actually anchored in a fear of the machine. And in order to overcome my fears and to go against what Heidegger calls the essence of modern technique, I would have to engage with the machine on a more deeper level. So that's what I started to do. So I wanted to go beyond the graphical user interface. That's why I'm so much into technical histories, obviously. I also started to learn how to program. I learned BASIC, and then I learned Scheme, which is a dialect of Lisp. But I also decided to go back because that was, for me, a way, because how can you understand this if you don't have a degree in computer science? So I also decided to try and understand it better by going back to its history, essentially to some of the basic sources, but biased as I was by my analytical philosophy education, the sources I read mostly were those coming from mathematical logic. And this really biased me, and I made mistakes because of that. I'm quite aware of that. So my PhD then focused on the relations between the theoretical results by Turing post-Church and the actual computational practices. What is the relevance of these theoretical results for actual computations, both historically but also mathematically? In the PhD, I combined a number of approaches. So there was historical research, there was some philosophy, but there was the second part was actually full of mathematical proofs and computer experiments. Okay, so when writing the NOMAD paper, then I will skip that. So I was actually very surprised when I went back to the PhD when I had to write the NOMAD paper, and I was kind of surprised to see very naive statements, but still kind of confirming, my later career as a nomad. That I really wanted to not specialize, but open myself up to other domains and mix methods. So because of all this, my disciplinary identity became quite vague, if not undefined. And I went to a number of very different conferences, and I spoke to a variety of communities. So I spoke with historians of mathematics, historians of computing, but also philosophers, analytical philosophers, and continental philosophers. The best community for me personally were the artists. I was at some point a fellow at the Kunsthochschule in Cologne. I spoke to computer scientists. I went to their conferences. And before I got sick, I had attended two programmer conferences, which were very nice. So, but of course, that was never easy. So also here, I tend to feel uncomfortable before any audience because I'm never pure in a sense. But as I said, I kind of accept this identity now. So anyway, this nomadism is driven conceptually by the idea that the computer is not one thing but many different things, an observation that was also made by Mike Mahoney. But more deeply, on a more deeper level, it's also about a desire to comprehend my or our current situation, which also has a certain activist dimension, the belief that actually we can make a change even as humanities researchers. You can call that naive, but I really need that to kind of continue what I'm doing. And of course, this activism and this desire to be activist increased with the worry about the commercial and political interests that we see more and more emerging in computational context. And yes, I'm speaking of people like Musk and Zuckerberg. So I now very quickly go a bit more into the details of what I mean, the value for me of what I call nomadism. I think the most important thing about this is that it gave me a sensitivity for blind spots, unconscious dogmatisms, assumptions that are made in a variety of professions about the computing fields, and so this includes computer scientists and programmers, but also I think historians and philosophers. Of course, I realize that it doesn't make much sense to claim such an approach as one that is only accessible to people like me. So I started to reflect, how can you turn this into a more practical thing? How can this become a practice? And that's why I showed the programming picture before. I think that if you think this can be a valuable approach, and that's an important if, in order for this to have value to others, I think that what we need is a very deep and broad collaboration, not just within the broad history of computing field itself, where I think it's essential to combine a diversity of methodological approaches without being dogmatist about certain approaches, but also beyond the boundaries of that field. And this is what I have tried to actually achieve, first of all, with the HAPO Commission, and then later with the programming group, which is a collective where we had historians, but also philosophers, computer scientists, logicians, artists, media theorists, and programmers. And for me, it's an experience, so it's very tough to kind of convey, what is meant. So I don't have the time to go much deeper into this. So what can be the gains for historians of computing here? First of all, it teaches you not to take anything for granted, especially not the standard narratives, and there are quite a lot. Secondly, and this is what I was hinting at with this broader collaboration amongst historians, there is this idea of a more completed history, which would integrate a variety of perspectives, because I firmly believe that we need, for instance, the social historians, but I also think we need the people who focus more on the technical stuff. So I don't want to create an opposition here, I rather aim for a collaboration. And also I believe that this kind of way of thinking allows to develop alternative visions to our current situation, and this obviously brings me to the presentism. So as I said before, and as is clear probably, my presentism implies a certain activism, and I think, and this is a belief that actually we can make a change, and I think Ha-Seok Chang stated this quite clearly in one of his papers. It is about a commitment to investigate history based on a clear and conscious engagement with our present, ultimately in order to improve that present. So yes, so I'm sorry, I have to move on quickly, because I have to return to the paradox and the problem. So what does this tell us about the paradox from my perspective? As argued in the previous part, I believe the history of computing needs to face a basic paradox. The fact that in pursuing its values of externalism and anti-anachronism and its inscription in the history of technology, it risks to undermine those very same values. From my approach then, it is key to question those values and consider valuable alternatives. So to start, we must dare question the methodological focus on decentering. Surely there are good and valuable reasons to decenter, but there is an inclination to see anything that does not fit with this as being internalist and hence bad. It's history of the low-hanging fruit variety. This, to me at least, is flirting with methodological dogmatism, which I think will not contribute to the survival of our field. Moreover, it implies that, as historians, we embrace the black box picture that is sold to us by an industry, and so we must dare ask how such decentering can help us in emancipating the computer user, provided we accept that division of labor even in our profession. Second, we need to raise the question of the inscription of the history of computing in the history of technology only. I fear that this confirms existing and problematic communication gaps in the field. There is a huge distance nowadays, also in the field of computing itself, between the professionals and the academic people. Now I lost yeah. As historians, I believe we must dare ask about computer science again, and historically try and understand what its relation is and can be to the technology sides. A history of missed opportunities, for instance, could be interesting. This approach also leads to a tentative answer to the problem of scope, I believe. So I agree with Tom Haig that we should not just accept the disappearance of the core topics from the discourse and celebrate that we can talk about computing everywhere. In fact, I believe now more than ever that we are in need to recenter on some core topics. Not only do we have plenty of literal blind spots in the history of computing, but there are also a number of standard narratives often inherited from the computing field itself that are taken for granted without further study. to be clear here, I do not think that this refocusing should end up in another methodological reductionism and focus only on the technical histories, but instead strive for a completed history. And I think this kind of work, I fully believe that this kind of work is only possible through both broader collaborations. I actually had 2 cases to illustrate what I'm trying to present to you. So this is a result from the programming group, and so extends the boundary of history. And the second one was a study I did with Ksenia Tatarchenko and Anya Yermakova, which was one of the, I even get chicken skins when I speak about it. It was an extremely beautiful interaction and collaboration that we had during COVID. So I knew Ksenia before, but I never even had met Anya. So, and it essentially, this offers an alternative vision, which is more humanist on the notion of algorithm, by reinscribing it in the Russian-speaking tradition related to the concept of poznanie, which is a very different take on knowledge. But I cannot go into it here. So yes, I have a tentative conclusion, but I hope that my conclusion is more or less clear already. One thing I wanted to say is that I think it is important to, I really liked the paper by Gavroglu, The Sisyphean Fate of the History of Science. I was very touched by the keynote he gave at ESHS in Brussels, where he declares that the history of science is threatened, and he kind of argues for a more activist stand to work together against this threat of a second death. But to work against that threat, we will have to change gears. We cannot be ourselves, be frozen by our own histories. And then I promised in the abstract some potential interactions between historians of mathematics and computing, but I leave that for the discussion, and I would like to close here with a quote from Nick Cave, which I always liked. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for the time.
We have 3 minutes and 8 seconds for questions.
Thank you, this was very interesting. So in your sort of autobiography, I was struck by the fact that you mentioned disciplines, fields, concepts, but not groups of people, institutions, or places, in respect to nobility. And going back to the first half of your talk, I was wondering the ubiquity or invisibility of computers.
Sorry?
Sorry?
I missed the last
sentence. The ubiquity and
yes.
invisibility of computers and programs that you mentioned, to me, does not seem to be the same in the US or in the EU. I think of the EU-led legislation cookies, which makes programs much more visible to us than elsewhere, to say nothing of China or other parts of the world. So I was wondering how geography, and especially social and political geographies, play in that in the discussion of scope.
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. So do you want me to answer with respect to the history of computing itself? Because I think there is a very important distinction to be made between historians of computing based in the US and the historians of computing based in the EU. And then also like Ksenia, for instance, who is not, literally based in Russia for the moment, but she's a scholar of history of computing in the USSR. So I think there is a difference in style. So I think the US history, and I think this very much relates to the point that Tom Haig made in the Tears of Donald Knuth paper, the job market is very different. And so I think a consequence of the reality of that job market is indeed that the methodology that is being used is quite, is done in a very particular style, which I engage with. I think the historians in the EU I have worked with often have a background in mathematics or computer science, and they tend to be a little bit broader in their analysis. So initially I had a slide at the start of my talk quoting Hamming, where he was a Turing Award winner, and that lecture he has this idea that I will give the impression that I'm, speaking of black and whites in the sense of, this is the reality, but of course the reality is a scale of gray. But in order to make an argument, sometimes you have to create a dichotomy, even though it's not completely honest towards the reality of the field. So I have done that to make to bring the argument across. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, we can discuss later, yes.
29 seconds. Anyone with a very quick question?
Okay, it's not a question to Liesbeth, but I guess to everybody else, which is it seems like from what you're saying that what the history of computing could benefit from is some historians of mathematics working on materials.
That was the last slide that I could not
Yeah.
discuss.
So yeah, why not try checking out some of the 1970s and 1980s theoretical computer science? You might find some fun math stuff there.
But perhaps when we add, perhaps when we add that historians of mathematics will also benefit from historians of computing working. So
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, so the slides considered both directions. So sorry.
We're minus 17 seconds. And so nobody's experimented, have they, with what happens if we go on beyond?
No, it's
Does
fine.
coffee disappear or something? I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much.